The Waco miniseries is an exciting, dramatic, and ultimately sad telling of the 51-day siege on the Branch Davidians. Much of what happens during the siege is hazy, but the fictional show still perpetrated some falsehoods. Here are some lies that Waco told you about the infamous siege. Waco unambiguously shows the ATF firing the first shots on February 28, shooting at the Branch Davidians' dogs. This is, in reality, just one theory for what happened. We don't know who shot first, and almost certainly never will. One theory posits that the ATF shot first by accident. An ATF agent climbing a ladder may have accidentally discharged his pistol in its holster, which would sound like it came from inside the building. Early on, an ATF agent suggested the first shot was indeed the ATF firing at dogs, but he later retracted his statement, according to Frontline. Meanwhile, two journalists at the scene claimed that the shots originated from inside the compound. The FBI also claimed to have video that proved the Branch Davidians shot first, but never showed it at trial. That both sides were ready to fight is without question. Between the time that had passed and the lack of tangible evidence, the truth about who fired the first shots is almost unknowable. To this day, both the ATF and surviving Branch Davidians swear that the other side took the first shots. Waco shows David Thibodeau and David Koresh meeting at a Texas bar and quickly hitting it off. In the miniseries' reimagining, there's not a lot of time that passes between the two meeting and the siege starting. In reality, the two had met years earlier and several states away. In real life, the two reportedly met by chance in 1990 at a Guitar Center in Los Angeles, California. Thibodeau had just moved west and went to the musician's supply store to pick up a new set of drumsticks. Koresh happened to be in the same store and introduced himself. After spending some time talking music, Koresh handed Thibodeau a business card with Bible verses on it. Thibodeau had no interest in being in a Christian band, but Koresh suggested that he had different insights into Scripture. Thibodeau, unable to get this off his mind, called Koresh a week later. Several months of talking and gigs later, Thibodeau was invited to Mount Carmel.
Are you a tourist? Are you really willing to do this?
I'm for real.
John Eric and Drew Dowdle, executive producers of Waco, loved this detail and intended to include it, but just couldn't make it fit in the narrative. It ended up being a normal Hollywood case of compressing a timeline to tidy up a story that, in real life, was anything but. The David Thibodeau of Waco turns from something of a skeptic to an active member of the Mount Carmel community. He buys into David Koresh's rules, beliefs, and way of life, essentially becoming a member of the Branch Davidians. In real life, Thibodeau wasn't a member or a true believer. He mostly just lived there.
Everything that could be known by the human mind, all wisdom in one book.
Sorry, man. I'm not really into that.
Though Thibodeau still speaks highly of Koresh's ability to interpret Scripture, he never considered himself a Branch Davidian. He'd occasionally participate in Bible study and found Koresh's sermons fascinating, but was more of a resident of Mount Carmel than a practicing member. He never saw Koresh as the Messiah and recognized he was deeply flawed. He was just a friend. When Thibodeau testified during congressional hearings on the siege, he was noted in the public record as someone who, quote, lived at the Branch Davidian residence but did not consider himself to be a member of the Branch Davidian religious community. Years later, when interviewed on an episode of Megyn Kelly Today, Thibodeau's unusual status as an outsider among the Branch Davidians was once again affirmed.
David is now living in Maine I said, "Are you still a Branch Davidian?" He said, "I never realized I was one. I was just living with my friend David in a compound, and things went south."
The Branch Davidians are depicted in Waco as almost exclusively American. This makes sense from a narrative perspective. The series pointedly depicts the siege as a uniquely American tragedy. But this approach overlooks an important aspect of the true story. Many of the Mount Carmel residents were foreign nationals. David Koresh and his leadership group made several trips overseas to recruit new followers. Along with Steve Schneider, Koresh visited England around 1988, where he preached his gospel to packed rooms. Altogether, they recruited 30 followers, though contemporaneous reports indicate only 26 of them were on hand for the siege, 24 of whom were dead by the end of it. Also around 1988, Koresh visited Australia. It was there that he met and recruited Graham Craddock, one of the 9 survivors of the siege who still reportedly believes in Koresh's divinity. Several people from New Zealand, including sisters Grace and Rebecca Adams, flew to Texas to join the Branch Davidians. Grace faced abuse at the compound and left when her visa expired in 1991, but not before getting treatment at a California psychiatric hospital. Rebecca ultimately perished in the blaze. In Waco, Steve Schneider's death is depicted as self-inflicted, the result of him putting the gun in his mouth and pulling the trigger. While a blast to the head was mentioned on his autopsy report, it might not be how he actually died. Steve Schneider and David Koresh were indeed found dead in the same room, though far enough apart that the press at the time considered them each to have died alone. Koresh died of a gunshot, but Schneider was a bit more complicated. Early reports indicated that a gunshot may have contributed, and an FBI spokesperson contemporaneously suggested that Schneider killed Koresh and himself with the same gun. That seems to be the story that stuck, even though it's definitely not true. Family members of Branch Davidians hired their own pathologist to double-check the federal government's own autopsy reports, and both parties concurred. Per the New York Times, this pathologist concluded Schneider's death was, quote, smoke inhalation and carbon monoxide poisoning with possible traumatic head injury from either a blast or gunshot. Given that the compound was getting assaulted and bulldozed, there are other possible explanations for what could cause that head injury. But the FBI was still saying officially that Steve Schneider died from a gunshot wound months after the pathologist came to the smoke inhalation conclusion. We may never know for sure. One of the few unambiguous parts of the raid is David Koresh's death by gunshot. Waco depicts Koresh asking Steve Schneider to shoot him. This was all speculation. Nobody can quite be sure how Koresh was shot because the only possible witness is dead. When his body was recovered, Koresh had a bullet hole in the middle of his forehead, which took days to reconstruct. According to the Washington Post, the FBI initially indicated that Schneider shot Koresh and killed himself with the same gun, though this was partially contradicted by Schneider's autopsy report. It's also possible that Koresh shot himself or was killed by another member of the Branch Davidians. The FBI claims that they fired no shots that day, though several people died of gunshot wounds, possibly from members shooting each other when they realized there was no way out of the fiery blaze. Ultimately, nobody will ever know for sure who shot David Koresh. Waco makes it sound like the Branch Davidians were based on David Koresh's teachings and that Mount Carmel was built at his behest. This is a misconception held by many people, and one that was perpetrated by the fictional series. The Branch Davidians actually have a long history that precedes Koresh, who only became the group's leader after a protracted power struggle. The Davidians started as an offshoot of the Seventh-day Adventists in 1934. They were founded by a man named Victor Houteff, who later bought the property that would become Mount Carmel. Houteff died in 1955, and the group was split into two competing factions. The faction that ended up persisting went by the name Branch Davidians. David Koresh only joined the Branch Davidians in 1981, but quickly picked up a strong following. He spent much of the mid-'80s in a power struggle with George Roden, the group's heir apparent. Years of political and paramilitary maneuvering culminated in a 1987 shootout between their two camps, which saw Koresh and several of his followers charged with attempted murder. All were acquitted, and Koresh faced a mistrial. By that point, Koresh had become the de facto head of Mount Carmel. The feud ended once and for all in 1990 when Roden was arrested for killing another one of his rivals. It was only then that David Koresh became the undisputed leader of the Branch Davidians. Michael Shannon appears in every episode of Waco as Gary Nessner, an FBI negotiator tasked with taking down David Koresh. He's there for almost the entire raid, and things go south almost immediately upon his removal. This is only partially true. In reality, he was there for just 25 days before getting removed. He was kept on for most of the fictional series for the sake of narrative consistency. The real-life Nessner wasn't the sole negotiator, but he was by many estimates the most successful. He developed a decent rapport with Koresh and got 35 people released during his time. But he had tensions with other FBI and ATF agents, which led to his removal. In his own words, his supervisors saw him as a, quote, impediment to those who wanted to take a more aggressive role. No one else on the compound left after his firing until the escape of 9 people on day 51.
Right now, the only card we have to play is creating goodwill.
No, it's not. That's your only card, Gary.
Nessner also didn't watch Mount Carmel burn at his house. He was called into the FBI's headquarters on the final day of the siege. Upon seeing the fire, he says that he got more angry than he'd ever been in his life and walked out. The shootout in Waco lasts for only a very short time before a ceasefire is reached. It's a tense few minutes. In reality, it was a tense few hours. The intensity was mostly accurate, but it was just a small part of a far larger and longer gunfight. The timeline was compressed in the series for dramatic effect and storyline efficiency. According to the book True Crime: Mass Murders, the firefight was at full intensity for around 45 minutes and lasted for around, depending on the source, 2 to 3 hours. At the time, it was the longest gun battle in the history of U.S. law enforcement. Somehow, the ATF managed to get a call inside the compound. Details of how are scarce, but it's more likely the ceasefire was arranged directly between the ATF and Branch Davidians instead of through outside sources as the show depicts.
Go get help!
Me? You didn't bring a phone?
The main reason for the ceasefire? The ATF was running low on ammo. The Branch Davidians still had plenty. Taylor Kitsch's David Koresh is, if nothing else, a true believer. For all his many flaws, he buys into his own divine abilities. To this day, many hold this view about the real-life Koresh, but many FBI agents and some surviving Branch Davidians have doubts about how much Koresh believed in himself. Gary Nessner says the FBI team on site noticed David Koresh often altered or backtracked on his beliefs. One time he told Nessner that everyone would come out on Easter, but when the day arrived, he changed the deal, claiming the day was an Easter but not his Easter, whatever that means. More strikingly, when the FBI mentioned they had a Whataburger for dinner, Koresh reportedly said, "If it turns out I am the Son of God, the world's gonna find out about Whataburger." Again, whatever that means. Levity aside, Nessner found it curious that someone so outwardly sure of his own divinity would hedge his bets with "if." Additionally, FBI agent Byron Sage spent an hour talking to Koresh about his faith. During this time, Koresh implied that he had specific Christ-like abilities, but danced around outright calling himself Christ. The tipping point came when Sage said he was confident in his salvation and couldn't be talked out of it. Koresh made no attempt to change his mind, which was a major tell to Sage. A real Christ figure, he supposed, wouldn't turn down a challenge of faith like that. As Sage later recalled, "From that point forward, it's absolutely patently clear in my mind what we're dealing with. This guy is not delusional. He's not a messianic complex. He does not buy off on his own con." The character of ATF agent Jacob Vasquez, played by John Leguizamo, acts as Waco's Cassandra figure. His warning that David Koresh knows the ATF is coming falls on deaf ears, and he's thrown under the bus when his own agency calls him compromised after he expresses sympathy for them. This is only partially true, and plays on a lie that resulted in a lawsuit.
They're making him sound like David thinks he's Jesus or something, you know what I mean?
Oh, David?
Yeah, what?
Is he getting in your head?
Okay.
Shut up.
The real Jacob Vasquez is named Robert Rodriguez. Like Vasquez, he was an ATF agent assigned to spy on the Branch Davidians. According to the Waco Tribune-Herald, Rodriguez made 7 trips to the compound, at one point joining a 13-hour prayer service. Unlike Vasquez, Rodriguez never bought into David Koresh's way of life or became sympathetic to him. Koresh also never asked him to stop the raid. This was all based on falsehoods told by the ATF. While Koresh suspected that Rodriguez might be a government agent, he never singled him out. Rodriguez visited the compound the day of the raid only to find that Koresh was tipped off. Rodriguez excused himself and was seen off with a handshake. His supervisors did try to make him a scapegoat off of this. Rodriguez was so upset at the time that he sued the ATF for defamation and eventually got a $2.3 million out-of-court settlement. Waco decided to stick to the story that paints him as a turncoat, which might have something to do with why they gave the fictional character a different name. Given how the show ties Ruby Ridge to the Waco siege, it's worth addressing some of the misconceptions on the events in Idaho. It's understandable why they wouldn't want to spend too much time outside of Waco on a show named Waco, but the show compressed the Ruby Ridge timeline and tweaked some facts. Waco depicts the siege at Ruby Ridge lasting basically a day or two, but in reality it was an 11-day-long standoff. According to the Washington Post, the ATF also took even longer to realize they'd killed Vicki Weaver, as evidenced by the fact that they tried to bribe her out with pancakes the next morning. The Weavers were also given a chance to retrieve Vicki's body instead of just letting it decompose in the open. While Gary Nessner had a hand in negotiation tactics at Ruby Ridge, he wasn't physically present there. Bo Gritz was a part of negotiations, but it wasn't resolved in just a few minutes. Check out one of our newest videos right here. Plus, even more grunge videos about historical fact versus fiction are coming soon. Subscribe to our YouTube channel and hit the bell so you don't miss a single one.